Welcome to the weekly report. It's February 21 and I'm Robert Barwick. In today's news, even Moody's says Aussie banks are in deep you-know-what. The CEC chairman has exposed the British Crown's MDBA banker conspiracy to destroy the food bowl before a parliamentary inquiry. And mild-mannered Minister Tony Burke, a hardcore greenie. 1. Even Moody says that Australia's banks are in deep you-know-what. Last week, it was reported that on February 16, the Moody's ratings agency caused a shock by announcing a review of Australia's big four banks. Moody's restated its negative outlook about those banks and foreshadowed that the review might result in a credit rating downgrade. Now, our big four banks, remember, are the best performing banks in the world in the face of the global financial crisis. So why did they do this? Well, the issue for our banks, according to Moody's, is their foreign borrowings, which we've tended to harp on about in this news service. 43% of the big four banks' liabilities are loans that they've taken from overseas. 43%. Remember last week or the week before I reported that the banks had to borrow last year $154 billion to roll over some of that. This year they have to borrow $135 billion. And this is what Joe Hockey cottoned onto at the end of last year was going to be a big deal for the banks this year to have to borrow that money to roll over those obligations at a time when all the world's governments will be trying to borrow money to roll over their obligations. Now, this is a big embarrassment for our banks for this reason. This is Moody's saying that their credit rating might be garbage. Moody's, one of the three companies that rated all the crap, the toxic garbage of the global financial crisis, the derivatives, the collateralized debt obligations, the credit default swaps, Moody's rated them all AAA. They're now saying our banks might be deserving of a credit rating downgrade. How embarrassing for the banks. I must say, you get the sense with these ratings agencies like Moody's, they ordinarily in the past would have turned a blind eye to these issues, but they know that their credibility is shot, so maybe they're trying to do their job for once, and this is showing the banks up. So the issue for the banks is their foreign loans. Now, the banks, like I said, they're scrambling to roll over those loans. Reportedly, when they're borrowing this extra money to roll over their loans, they're trying to borrow from domestic sources. They're trying to borrow longer term to roll over most of their foreign loans were short-term 90-day loans. They're trying to do that. But what we've also recently found out is the banks are actually trying to replace their foreign loans with foreign deposits. Deposits have shot up in Australia's banks in the last 12 months or so. Shot up. Now, the economists say this is because Australians aren't spending, we're saving. Garbage. There's a cost of living crisis in this country. Australians aren't spending because when they're finished paying their food bill and their fuel bill and their electricity bill, they've got nothing left to spend. They're not saving. Our banks are offering big deposit rates, and that is attracting a lot of money in from overseas as a carry trade. That's where the rise in deposits is coming from. And there's a particularly important reason for all this. The banks can't just extract themselves from all their foreign obligations because that's money. All this money, whether it's deposits or foreign loans, has been lent into Australia's property market. And at all costs, our banks have to keep that property market up. So they are scrambling in order to do that. And if they have to replace one source of finance, they've got to get it from another one so they can keep their property market up. Why? Because the level of exposure our banks have to the property bubble, really the world's last surviving property bubble, is such that when that bubble blows, not if, when, our banks will blow with it. Everyone involved in the banking system knows that. Most of all the banks, which is one of the reasons they're running around the world saying there is no bubble, right? Because they know that if people know there is, they'll know they're goners. There's another particular aspect of the property bubble that the banks also depend on enormously. It's only their mortgages, which is half their business, that allows the banks to keep capital reserves that meet the regulator's requirements. Now, those regulatory requirements are pretty pathetically low, but the capital reserves are what tells you whether a bank's solvent or not. So to pretend they're still solvent, the banks have to try and meet those regulatory requirements, and only their mortgages allow them to do that. Why? Because the regulator says you've got to keep about 8% of all your loans in reserve. 8% in case something goes wrong with those loans. In order, your ability to withstand those losses is because of your capital reserve. So they set 8%. But APRA, the Australian regulator, tells the banks that they can regard mortgages as super safe, and they let them get away with only keeping 2% capital reserve against the $1.1 trillion they've got lent out in mortgages at the moment. 2% against loans that are into a bubble. This is nuts. But that 2%, it's not that they so much let them do it, the banks wouldn't be able to put up more than 2%. These are insolvent banks, and APRA is abetting them in pretending that they're solvent this way. It has a flow-on effect. Banks are withdrawing credit from other sectors of the economy, such as agriculture, which I'll talk about in a minute in the Murray Darling Basin, and small business, which are regarded as riskier loans, therefore they have to put up greater capital reserves. They're withdrawing credit from those areas to put into mortgages so that they can help them reduce their levels of capital reserve that way as well. This is a scam. Our banks are completely shot. This can't go on, as we've long stated. We'll be putting out a press release this week to make this point. In America, they've just had the Financial Crisis Inquiry Commission run by Phil Angelides. This Angelides Commission's findings have set a new benchmark for honesty when it comes to public inquiries into the financial system. That benchmark for honesty has to be applied in Australia to our banking system, and by that benchmark, our government has to act on the banks and put them into reorganisation along the lines that the CEC has long called for. A Glass-Steagall, Homeowners and Bank Protection Bill, etc. So, look out for our press release on that. All right, second thing I want to talk about. This week, the CEC Chairman, Anne Lawler, exposed the British Crown's Murray Darling Basin Authority-banker conspiracy to destroy the food bowl, and she called for an Egypt here in Australia. So Anne Lawler on February 16 testified before the Tony Windsor Committee in Dubbo. Her testimony was exposing how the British Crown's Murray Darling Basin Authority is using the banks, and this aspect of the banks that I've just talked about, where they want to withdraw their money from agriculture, they're using that fact to get the banks to force farmers to sell their water rights so that to pay debt. That way the MDBA gets to meet its buyback targets and the banks get out. All this has been revealed in the report commissioned for the MDBA by former Babcock and Brown banker Adrian Ritzer. And at this meeting, in her discussions, reported she met farmers on the ground who confirmed in their own experiences what the banks are doing. This is not getting publicity. At the moment, it's a silent genocide that's happening out there, and it's a deliberate genocide. In his report, Ritzer recounts the banks know the full impact of what they are doing. They know it will cause a wave of suicides, and they're going to do it anyway. The reason they know it will cause a wave of suicides is because the banks, when they talked to Ritzer, compared it to what happened during dairy deregulation 10 years ago, when that caused a wave of suicides, and they're fully prepared to go through that again. In a press release that you can see on our website that Anne issued last week, following this, you see the same deliberate intent in the current milk price war being run by a British team in charge of Coles. So Coles has hired a British team to run this milk price war. It's being reported as a price war between Coles and Woolies, and it's not. It's a price war between the retailers run by this British crowd and the farmers to drive the farmers into bankruptcy. And in conclusion, Anne said, when you look at this whole picture, it is time for an Egypt in Australia. The Egyptian people, confronted with dire food shortages, rose up and demanded a change of the system, the globalisation system that Mubarak had presided over, which put them in that position. And that precipitated a peaceful, or a relatively peaceful, change of government. We need an Egypt in Australia to change this system. right? It's not about changing a single act of Parliament. We have to change the system. All right, finally, I just want to talk about mild-mannered Minister Tony Burke, who is actually a hardcore greenie. When the MDBA released their guide, we warned Australians, and especially farmers, do not fall for the mild-mannered persona of Tony Burke, because we reminded people what he did in the case of the Australian Wheat Board issue. Right up to the last minute, the farmers thought Burke was on their side, and then at the last minute, he canned the Wheat Board and opened up Australia to the kind of speculation driven by international cartels like Cargill, and now Cargill owns a big chunk of that Wheat Board. Tony Burke is Australia's Environment Minister, but he's got a long title. He's Minister for Environment, he's Minister for Water, and he's Minister, remember, for Sustainable Population. He was initially appointed Minister for Population, and then Julia Gillard named him Minister for Sustainable Population. It turns out that his appointment in that position, which was to replace, if you remember, a well-known hardcore greenie, Peter Garrett, Burke's appointment in that position was no coincidence. Because it's not like Burke is like the rest of the Labor MPs who come up as union hacks, sort of mindless drones of the unions and get a job in the Labor Party and then get into Parliament and make their way to the top. In a very revealing profile in this last weekend's Weekend Australian, Tony Burke revealed that what caused him to join the Labor Party is his activism as a greenie. It was as a greenie, specifically an activist with the Wilderness Society, Bob Brown's gang, that drove Burke to think, I'm going to get into politics, and he became a member of the New South Wales Labor Party to become the minister. In other words, this guy is cut from exactly the same cloth as Peter Garrett. He's no friend of the farmers. He is one of the wave of green radicals that have been sponsored by the British Crown to take over this country in the last 30 years or so. They cut their teeth on issues like the Franklin Dam, or in his case, the Daintree Rainforest in North Queensland, and then they get themselves in a position of Parliament. So when he's confronted with this issue of the Murray Darling Basin Authority, his green axioms is what's going to drive what he's going to do. And I just want to make this point while I'm on this subject of Burke and Sustainable Population Australia, only because it's topical in the news. As you know, there's a big brouhaha at the moment about the Christmas Island refugees and the funeral in Sydney last week for some of the people who died. And Scott Morrison, the shadow immigration minister, made a comment that he's being attacked for as racist. Someone leaked that in shadow cabinet he said the coalition should take on the issue of Muslims not integrating and take advantage of that or capitalise on it. Julia Gillard is calling for Morrison to be dumped from the front bench as a racist. Well, I'm not defending Morrison, he probably is, and he probably should be dumped from the front bench. Both sides are racist when it comes to this, but there's an interesting point tie in here with Tony Burke and shows the hypocrisy of this system. Remember, it was Julia Gillard who named Burke Sustainable Population Minister. Why? Because she's in on the campaign being run by people like Kelvin Thompson, her fellow Fabian Society member in the Labor Party, Dick Smith, etc., to create a small Australia or a sustainable Australia. The organisation that they work with to achieve this is Sustainable Population Australia. Kelvin Thompson famously encouraged everybody in Australia to join Sustainable Population Australia. Well, who are Sustainable Population Australia? Remember, this is the crowd, specifically through one of their founders, Mark O'Connor, who call for an actually racist immigration program into this country. Because they want an immigration program which bars immigrants from developing countries from coming here on the grounds that if they come to Australia, they will raise their living standards because they're from third world developing countries and we're a first world country. And by raising their living standards, they'll raise their consumption, and that will destroy the planet. That's their logic. That's their cover for being actually racist. This is the crowd Julia Gillard's in bed with. So if all racists should be dumped from the Australian Parliament, then let them all be dumped and we'll replace them. It's not just racist, this policy, it's evil. So on that, stay tuned for more developments. Thanks for tuning in.